I like the sound of 11 even more than the round number of 10 of last year. It means continuity and tradition. I'm Bob Shapiro, chair of the board of the Roper Center Board of Directors. I'm also a Columbia University professor who does research on the historical study of American public opinion. So the Roper Center, as the archive of public opinion data, is special to me. Now, each year when I've done this welcome, I've enjoyed speaking at great length and enthralling everyone about the importance of public opinion research and what the Roper Center is doing. But tonight I want to repeat what I did last year in Washington when I said, I'll forego the speech. Please assume that I've spoken at length and you've been appropriately enthralled. And we can move on to what is more important. I want to thank you all for attending this event. Not just this one time, but every year or every other year here in New York or Washington. And of course, I want to thank especially our donors, actually our continuing and sustained donors, for their support of the Andrew Kohut Fund, the Warren Matovsky Fund, and the Roper Center. Our corporate donors are, and I'd like to just name them, Princeton Survey Research Associates International, Langer Research Associates, Belden Rusinello Strategists, D3 Systems, Thortech Solutions, Edelman Research, and NORC, the National Opinion Research Center. Two companies purchased tables, Edison Research and SSRS. And of course, please note that we have many individual donors as well, and they're acknowledged in the program. I want to thank my fellow board members of the Roper Center Board for their continued hard work. I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning at the board meeting at Columbia University. Tonight, and this is an understatement, tonight would not have occurred without the following people who've made all this happen. Fellow board members Nancy Belden, Diane Colasanto, Susan Pincus, Evans Witt, Brett Powell, and Diane Bowers. And also special thanks to Kavi Cardos and Nora Price. I thank you all. The Roper Center would not exist without its data providers, the survey organizations that archive their data at the Roper Center. We are most grateful to them, and also to the Roper Center's members who use these data for a wide range of increasingly interesting and important research. The Roper Center, as you know, is now happily in place at its new home at Cornell University. And I now have the great pleasure of yielding the floor to Professor Peter Enns, the Executive Director of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research at Cornell. Peter.
Thank you very much, Bob. It was at this Matovsky dinner 2 years ago when I had the privilege to announce that the Roper Center had just moved to Cornell and the Roper at Cornell website had just gone live. It's been a busy 2 years. Lots of support from the Roper Center board, which we greatly appreciate. We have an amazing staff at the Roper Center, including Brett Powell, who's our associate director. Kathleen Weldon oversees and directs the data archive. And Bill Block has given us immeasurable support as the director of Cornell's Institute for Social and Economic Research. In the last 2 years, we've passed many milestones. Last year alone, we added 339 new data sets. Many of those surveys were conducted and then provided by the people in this room, so thank you. We also added almost 150,000 new questions to iPoll in the last year, and we are just about to cross the 700,000 question mark. And as you know, these data have a profound impact. Users viewed 974,587 questions in iPoll last year, and 20,889 data sets were downloaded for analysis just in the last year. And the users of the data range from high school students to PhD students. Users include researchers and academics from across the disciplines and around the world. Those writing and conducting surveys rely on the Roper Center to see how questions have been written in the past and to compare current results with past data. And some of the largest media organizations and local news use the data to convey the public's preferences back to the public. And your support helps make all of this possible. Money raised at last year's Matofsky dinner not only supports the work I've described, but has also made it possible for us to preserve and archive polls and survey data from 21 countries around the globe during the last year. Last summer, we were also proud to welcome our first Andrew Kohut Fellows. Many of you have supported the Kohut Fellowship Fund. Jose Tomas Sanchez, who's a PhD student at Cornell, who's studying Latin American politics, was one fellow. During his fellowship over the summer, Jose focused on public opinion data from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Chile. And this allowed Jose to analyze shifting political ideology right up to Pinochet's military coup. And so that offered an unprecedented window into public opinion during the shift from democracy to authoritarian rule in Chile in 1973. Jose wanted to be here tonight. He has a newborn, so traveling to New York City was not possible. Our second Kohut fellow was Claire Liu. Claire is a junior at Cornell, and she is able to join us. And over the summer as a fellow, Claire's research focused on public attitudes toward fake news. And what Claire found was that most of the public, looking at survey data, is concerned with fake news. The public is overconfident about its ability to identify fake news. And so a crucial insight of Claire's work is that raising concern or awareness about fake news is not the challenge for those who want to address this issue. The challenge is getting individuals to recognize that they themselves are susceptible to fake news. And so I encourage you to, if the opportunity is possible tonight, chat with Claire, ask her more about the implications of her findings and her experiences as a Kohut Fellow with the Roper Center. We at the Roper Center are proud of our Kohut Fellows. We are proud of the work we've been able to do over the last 2 years, and we thank you for your continued support. And I think Tom Smith is coming up now.
So, we're here to take and visit with Howard Schuman tonight. I've been visiting and reading Howard's work for 40 years. And matter of fact, the first 1977, I wrote the first 2 GSS methodological reports, and Howard's work is cited in both of them. In 1978, Howard joined the GSS Methodological Advisory Board. He served on that into the 80s, and then things were reorganized, and he served on our Board of Overseers during that time. About that same time, he and a colleague of his, Stan Presser, wrote a very nice little book, Questions and Answers. I was asked to write a review for the American Sociological Journal of Sociology on that book, and I'll just read a little excerpt. I said that the volume makes an enormous contribution to the field of survey methodology and ranks with such classics as Hyman's Interviewing and Kish's Survey Sampling. To the extent that survey research is only as reliable as its methodology, this book becomes a long missing foundational stone for the social sciences in general. Now, I still consult that book today. It is the book that has the most marginal notes and the most underlinings of any book that I have. And as I say, something that even though it was written in 1981 is still something I consult on a regular basis today. Now, a thing that I did write recently, in which I did, of course, have to look back at this book, was I was asked by the Sage Encyclopedia of Social Research Methods to write a biographical article about Howard. And in it, I shared the draft of it with Howard, and he gave me some very helpful suggestions. I'll mention one of them. I had a sentence that talked about the breadth and depth of Schuman's monumental contributions to the social sciences and survey research. Now, Howard, besides his academic and scholarly achievements, also has the attribute of modesty. He asked me to take out the word monumental, which I agreed to do. But Howard, tonight, I'm putting monumental back in and recognizing that. I'll end by mentioning a kind of example of living monuments to Howard. He's not only a great researcher, but is an accomplished professor and teacher who mentored many absolutely excellent students over the years. And we'll be hearing from three of them tonight, and I have the pleasure of introducing the first of them, a man who I also know very well for about as long as I've known Howard. He was a little younger when we started that relationship, but Stan Presser is, as I mentioned before, the co-author of Questions and Answers, and of course went on with a very illustrious career with many other publications after that point, and a long career starting at Maryland, NSF, and for the last several decades at the University of Maryland. And so it is my pleasure then to take and pass the podium on to Stan, who will take and make his remarks. Stan.
Thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. When I was asked to prepare these remarks, I was told that Howard wanted the presenters to minimize honorifics. So, in accord with his instructions to Tom about editing the biographical piece, I won't say anything about the awards that Howard's books have won, the major journals that he edited, or the prestigious groups to which he's been elected. Instead, I will try to describe some of what made Howard a wonderful teacher, which I believe is related to his desire to minimize honorifics. When I began to work with Howard on the project that led to Questions and Answers and Attitude Surveys, I had just finished 2 years of graduate school, had limited survey experience, and had published only in my high school newspaper. By contrast, Howard was a full professor, had a wealth of survey experience, and had published 3 books and many journal articles. But these differences seemed of little concern to him. Howard treated me as though I were an equal partner in the enterprise. There were numerous design issues to be settled, innumerable choices about which items to test and how to do so, and many decisions about how to conduct and then interpret data analyses, which led to ideas for further analyses and then to still more experiments. We discussed all of these at great length. In retrospect, it is clear that Howard contributed much more than I did. But at the time, he made it seem as if our contributions were not separable, that the discussion outcomes were ours as opposed to his or mine. That although we may have had different initial thoughts, at the end of the day, or more often even our work habits, the end of the night, it seemed unclear who had come up with the idea or plan we eventually settled upon. Howard may have acted this way for more than one reason, but very likely an important consideration was his conception of research as a search for knowledge, as opposed to a method for proving what one suspects or believes. Our collaboration taught me what Howard knew, that it could be more rewarding to make a discovery than to demonstrate one's prior suspicion or belief was correct. And as Howard also taught me, the chances of a discovery often depend not so much on one's status and previous experience as on new ideas and less common or not taken for granted perspectives. In other words, I believe Howard was acting on the belief that discovery is promoted by seeking out and encouraging the views of others that differ from your own. That making discoveries requires a paradoxical blend of self-confidence and humility. Now, lest this sound solely like a lesson in the philosophy or sociology of science, I hasten to add that at the same time, Howard taught me research could be great fun. This was partly due to our enjoying the give and take of discussion. But it was also due to Howard's sense of humor, his playfulness, and his love of laughter. Every April 1st, he would arrange some initially quite convincing and then truly funny April Fool's Day joke. Among my favorites was the announcement he made as Survey Research Center director in 1987 that the center had been awarded a new contract, all the data collection for the 1990 decennial census. An announcement followed by Howard's description of the many ways this new work would change life at the center. Although April Fool's Day jokes occurred on schedule, most of Howard's humor was spontaneous. His humor wasn't something added on or supplemental. It was simply part of research. More generally, Howard didn't see research as separate and apart from other domains of life. Thus, the only formal course I took with Howard, a seminar on public opinion that led to my working with him, met not in a classroom at the university, but in the top-floor study of his Ann Arbor home. Although I have referred to having collaborated with Howard, as you've no doubt realized, my experiences may be better described as mentoring. The kind of mentoring that several generations of his students experienced. Successful mentors are role models. And when I mentioned to Howard a couple of years ago that he was a role model, he responded, "If I had known I might be a role model, I would have dressed more neatly and proceeded in less of a trial plus many errors fashion." On behalf of a host of others who are not here tonight, I can say, Howard, we wouldn't have had it any other way. Finally, by way of introducing or transition to our next speaker, I want to say that forming bonds with Howard's other students has been a special bonus of working with him. So I'm delighted now to introduce Larry Bobo, another Michigan PhD mentored by Howard. Larry is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, where he chairs the Department of African and African American Studies. Larry.
Thank you very much, Stanley, and good evening, everybody. It's a delight for me to be back in the company of so many survey researchers. It's been a little while since I was embedded in this particular family, though I've always felt a deep attachment to it. And I was thinking about what to talk about this evening, and I know Howard didn't want us to just go on and on with praise or to simply do biographical tales. So I want to talk about what I regard as one very distinctive intellectual strand of Howard's contribution, that place where survey research meets the study of race relations in the U.S., and in particular that conjunction that led to him spearheading the project that produced the first and then a slightly revised and then a truly major revised edition of the book, Racial Attitudes in America, Trends and Interpretation. And I'll do it kind of in a way of a little bit of history. Howard will know this, but I don't know that anyone has written it up, and someday someone should. But it in many ways grew out of the old aspiration to develop the social indicators movement. If you remember that moment in the social sciences where we were going to be tracking major social trends. And the SSRC was spearheading a major effort to launch a series of books that were going to be benchmark social indicator studies. And I don't remember now if we were the first or second book, but only 3 of them were ever done. Ren Farley did one on blacks in the economy, Andrew Cherlin did one on the family, and then there was the initial Racial Attitudes in America book, which Howard led, involving Charlotte Stee and then myself as a graduate student who got involved. But it made an enormous amount of sense in that moment for SSRC to have kind of turned to Howard and ask if he would take on such a kind of audacious project to tell us how racial attitudes in America had changed and to do it on the basis of what systematic sample survey data had to tell us. Because he'd done what I've always regarded as exceptionally interesting work on the nature of prejudice early in his career, works that I still draw on and find it a little disappointing that more people don't go back to today because they would still learn a great deal from it. Basic theories of prejudice. Prejudice is the norm of rationality. Papers on sympathetic identification with the underdog in the 60s. A paper he disavows the title of, originally titled Sociological Racism, but he changed to Free Will and Determinism in beliefs about race. All of these things preceded that moment of working on racial attitudes in America, as did the book Black Racial Attitudes, Trends and Complexities with Shirley Hatchett, the 15 city studies for the Kerner Commission after the riots that he worked on with Angus Campbell, and work on race of interviewer effects with Gene Converse and Shirley Hatchett and others. But he pursues a grant to fund this project that becomes Racial Attitudes in America, and through some quasi-competition of sorts, I end up being hired to be the research assistant on this project after he'd already brought Charlotte Stee on board. And one of the first things he did to show the systematic quality of how Howard approaches all these things, and very much apropos of this award, this moment in this organization, is we contract with the Roper organization to produce a great compilation of all the racial attitude questions that are in the Roper Center archive. So we have a huge data printout to try to identify those items that have been, and I think the criteria he told me, asked more than once, separated by a period of at least 5 years, something like that. We kind of went through and tried to generate a list of the items that would be the pool for the study, our basic sample. And we found at that time 32 questions that had met that basic criteria in national surveys, and they were the core of that first book, which I think, not speaking for myself, but really for Howard, was certainly regarded as the definitive chronicling of at least what the survey research literature had to tell us about changing racial attitudes at the time. And what's not appreciated is that the project really in many ways had a further reach than that, but Howard, rather than trying to make an enormous, grandiose theoretical statement in one place, did several pieces of the study kind of in other outlets, which was interesting. But I want to say a bit more about his methodological approach. So once we have the pool of questions, we then wrestle with how comparable are the samples? Are the question wordings exact over time? How much should we care that terms like colored, Negro, black vary over the span of time for these sorts of questions? Did they have explicit don't know categories or not? And what is the order within the questionnaire? And that particular question actually ended up resolving one of the key puzzles in the data when we had the question that was literally, in some ways, the most general question we had, and I wish I'd brought the exact wording with me. I want to ask Maria if she can remember how the general segregation item is actually worded. Maria, do you remember? No. Is it should blacks and whites generally live together or separate or something else? And it was odd because all the items at that very general level had shown unambiguously positive trends toward more integration, but this one item got to 1972 and then just went the opposite direction. People moved out of the integration response, total contradiction to every other item in that pool. And Howard says, are you sure? Have you coded this right? Have you checked it? Have you had someone else check it? And this is part of the mentoring. He has this peppering with questions. Anyone who's been in Harvard's office is used to being peppered with questions, both intellectual and, I don't want to say needling, but are you sure it's right? Are you sure it's right? You know? And we concluded, yes, this trend was absolutely right. But what we discovered, okay, let's go back and look at the questionnaires. And it turns out that what happens is that in 1972, that question ends up being preceded by a very policy-focused question on whether the federal government ought to get involved in desegregating schools. And that had not been true prior to 1972. And that led us to then do an experiment to see if that was literally the context changed, and it did. And then that spearheaded a whole line of research on more theoretically driven experiments and surveys, not about context and ordering of questions per se, but about really changing the meaning of the issue to respondents and what that would tell us. So that was an exciting line of work. But two other things. People blame surveys for just being about attitudes, just about what's in their heads, just about what it's easy to say in response to a question. But as it turned out at the beginning, the project had two other dimensions to it, which were reported elsewhere. One, a very neat study of change over time in social behavior here in New York. I wonder if this was in the study. A study of how black and white couples were treated at restaurants in New York. A replication of a 1950 study, then done in 1981, that Howard and Eleanor Singer and Rebecca Donovan and Claire Seltitz published separately, showing some important change, but also depressingly in 1981, a number of places that were really still engaged in pretty serious discrimination against African Americans. So much so, and to show you how committed and thoughtful about the ethics of this Howard was, they turned the evidence over to the local kind of Ethics and Anti-Discrimination Commission, and the restaurants that were engaged in the most egregious behavior were seriously fined after the documentation was very clear on that front. And then there was other evidence to chase other contextual changes in the broader society, a tracing of New Yorker cartoons, for example, and how they depicted race over a nearly 30-year period, so that it wasn't just verbiage kind of in surveys. The book then comes to be updated. I think the updated edition is in 1997. At that point, Maria Creason joins the project and is certainly carrying a much heavier load than I ever did. The pool of questions to sample goes up to 50 or 54, depending on how you do the count, the core questions. Many conceptual issues are added, like what you believe about the nature of black-white inequality, how you feel about affirmative action that hadn't been there in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And much more sophisticated analysis of differences by gender, by age, and to a degree income, so that the book has served a lot of people for a long time as kind of a definitive probing of these things. And I'm always thankful for having been a part of that project, from having learned the kind of care and attention that is required to do good, meaningful research, and to do it in a way where you're not invested in the outcome. And the last thing I'll say, I remember when I was first on the job market as a PhD, I ended up getting 4 job offers. One of them was at UC Berkeley, and Howard thought I was going to rush off to Berkeley right away, that I'd always wanted to get back to California because that's where I'd grown up. And I decided not to. I decided to go to Madison, Wisconsin, of all places instead. And he kind of asked me why, and I said, when I do my job talk and do a piece of racial attitudes in America, someone asked me, well, how should the data have turned out? And I thought, That's really interesting. I don't know that I would have entered this expecting to say what was supposed to have happened here. And that was just such a theory-driven environment, and sometimes the data have to take you where they're going. And I really appreciated learning that lesson and learning it rather early, so I went to a place where I didn't, as Dan was saying, seek to confirm an idea I already had, but to do a careful job of designing data that really let one explore the full complexity of a phenomena, and sometimes you just have to live with that complexity and messiness rather than knowing the answer, and I've admired that. And I have one other task. As Stan said, there's a long kind of web of connection among students who worked with Howard, and it is my turn, in fact, to introduce someone who gets involved in a very different kind of intellectual stage and set of projects for Howard in the issues of collective memory, and that's Amy Corning, who's now at the University of Michigan, I think the Institute for Social Research, so I'm delighted to welcome her to the stage next.
I'm quite sure that Howard never thought of himself as leading the charge in online education. But he taught what may have been the very first online course in 1996. Shortly before I began the PhD program at Michigan, Howard had retired to Maine, but I still took a seminar with him, entirely by email. Howard would send me introductory notes each week. I did the readings and sent him informal reaction papers, and he followed up with comments. It was one of the most thought-provoking and rewarding courses I ever took. It was also excellent training for our extended, long-distance collaboration on collective memory. I have to say I've admitted defeat and given up trying to organize my email messages. I have 47,000 messages in my inbox, and at least 3/4 of them are from Howard. When Howard embarked on the collective memory work in the 1980s, most scholars focused on the cultural products or public practices that convey memories of past events. Research centered on monuments or memorials or analyzed the politics of memory at the level of elites. Howard adopted an entirely different approach. He investigated individuals' memories, using open-ended survey questions to ask respondents which national and world events they remembered as important. He wanted to understand how ordinary people remembered the past, a perspective on collective memory that was absent from the field at the time. Howard's research demonstrates the fundamental importance of generational experience in shaping collective memory. Over the years, his work has also played an invigorating role in the field of memory studies, prompting scholars to confront questions of just what collective memory is, where it resides, and how it can best be studied. He's shown that ordinary individuals' memories of national and world events must be taken seriously if we're to understand stability and change in collective memory. Perhaps most important, Howard's collective memory work illuminates some of the pathways through which cultural phenomena influence individuals and vice versa. My years of work with Howard have given me a vantage point from which to admire and appreciate the many qualities he brings to his research. I want to mention 3 especially. The first is Howard's wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. A look back at just a few days' worth of correspondence with him yielded these references. Copernicus, on how amendments to theory can be forced on the researcher by the data. David Baltimore, on expected anomalies in data. The Supreme Court, on the collective aspect of collective opinions. And Shakespeare's The Tempest, his favorite play. The same enthusiastic curiosity has led Howard to explore collective memory not in one country, but in a total of 8 so far. To approach the concept in terms of both the recent and the distant past, and to examine memory not just at one, but at many points in time. A second quality is Howard's creativity, most visible in his knack for turning challenges into opportunities. He writes that the problems that occur in surveys are opportunities for understanding once we take them seriously as facts of life. I would argue that this attitude underlies his approach to all kinds of research challenges. Howard shows that creativity does not have to mean complexity. The idea of asking a survey sample of respondents an open-ended question about national and world events is characterized by such simplicity and elegance that it's hard to believe no one had thought of it before. But of course, no one had. A third quality I've admired in Howard might be called tenacity or grit, a constellation of persistence, resilience, and determination. I've seen these reflected in his insistence on replication of findings, in his drive to re-examine previously analyzed data from new perspectives, and in his conviction that even data that don't yield easily to interpretation have something to tell us that we may eventually understand. Each of these qualities, in addition to his generous support and encouragement, has made Howard an extraordinary and valued mentor and friend. I'm afraid that the greatest test of his tenacity came not from intransigent data, but in the form of the multi-year hiatus I took from my dissertation. I resumed and then managed to complete it only because of Howard's persistent, impatient prodding. But whatever Howard demands from others, he also expects from himself. While we were working on research for our book, Howard was in a good bit of pain and had to have emergency gallbladder surgery. Later that night, Jo, his wife, emailed me to let me know how it had gone. She wrote, "Howard took his papers with him down to the operating room, thinking he might work on them if there was a wait. When the surgeon came up to talk with me, he brought them back with an amused smile." I want to close with a poem by Richard Wilbur that I think reflects Howard's sense of the mysterious way in which knowledge develops. It captures beautifully the balance between imagination or speculation and the need to confront ideas with reality. What the poet calls graceful errors might stem from initial research challenges, missteps, or unanticipated results that can end up expanding insight and understanding. The poem is called Mind. Mind in its purest play is like some bat that beats about in caverns all alone, contriving by a kind of senseless wit not to conclude against a wall of stone. It has no need to falter or explore. Darkly it knows what obstacles are there, and so may weave and flitter, dip and soar in perfect courses through the blackest air. And has this simile a like perfection? The mind is like a bat, precisely, save that in the very happiest intellection, a graceful error may correct the cave.
That was wonderful, and this is just a tiny microcosm of the people and lives that Howard has affected. But I want to point out before I introduce Howard is that he's not limited to students, colleagues, and mentors, but also, and the industry itself, but also a rich family with 2 boys and a daughter, Beth, Mark, who isn't here, but we have the pleasure of welcoming David Wade Schuman, his wife Kate Javins, And David has a small and wonderful tribute for his father.
This has absolutely nothing to do with survey research on any level whatsoever. But it does reflect on my father's grit, because I told him over and over again I did not want to do this, but he insisted. But there's a kind of, I don't know, maybe bizarre poetry to playing harmonica at a survey research meeting. So it is something I do. I also wanted to say, I've known my father my entire life. It's been a long time. Thank you. Howard Schuman.
Can you top that? I do want to say something as I introduce Howard. First of all, I'm Diane Bowers, and I'm on the Roper Board and also chair of the nominating committee. And I am so delighted that the nominating committee, which included Frank Newport from Gallup, Doug Rivers from Stanford University, and David Rothschild from Microsoft Research, along with the Roper Center Board of Directors, is honored, truly honored, to present the 2017 Matovsky Award for contributions to public opinion research to Howard Schuman. Howard. I'm going to show you this beautiful non-plaque award for Howard that is really very special and means so much to us, but I hope it means as much to you as it does to us, and I'm sure it does.
Thank you very, very much to everybody. This is the invitation you received, many of you, to come to the dinner. And it had a picture of me in it. I may look a little older than the photograph on the invitation you received for this evening. Had I known that Roper wished to emphasize youthful vigor, I could have provided a slightly earlier photograph that you can see somewhere. I'm not sure where it is. Oh. The horse was named Pepper. And as I recall, she lived up to her name. She bucked and helped riders dismount if they seemed to be too slow. In fact, Pepper and I were known as the Non-Response Brigade. We rounded up individuals to make sure they took part in whatever survey they were slated to be respondents in. I loved and admired Pepper, and I'm glad you can see her in her youth, as I was at once. I want to thank, of course, Stanley, Larry, and Amy, and indirectly Maria also, for the words spoken this evening, whether I deserve them or not. I'm not the easiest person to work with. I often forget dates and don't call when I say I will. So I'm not the easiest person to work with. I also want to thank Tom Smith for his part in this award. Tom seems to have read everything related to survey methods in recent years. And Bob Shapiro, with whom I've had a valuable email correspondence in recent weeks. Bob had good suggestions for this talk, which if I had followed more closely would quite likely have made it both shorter and better. My thanks also to the Roper organization and of course to Diane Bauer, who helped organize this gathering. Finally, I thank my son, David, who you've just heard, and his wife, Kate, for helping in many ways. David and Kate are both artists and art teachers in New York City. David also leads a band named Hazmat Modin that plays in New York City regularly and tours in Europe and elsewhere, most recently I think in Australia and New Zealand each summer. Our other two children would have liked to be here also. Mark, who lives in San Francisco, where he's an electronics engineer and systems programmer and saves us from endless troubles with our computers. And Beth, who lives in Camden, Maine. She's the author of a widely known book, The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. It's about an illness she experienced once after visiting us in Italy. Not, I think, due to us, but due to problems she ran into there. My wife, Jo, I can't really speak of because she is so important to our entire family. Her own work is as a writer, painter, and woodcut printmaker. And she recently wrote a story for children about a small boy and a toad, and about their friendship, and about natural history. Although the conversation between the toad and the boy were imaginary, everything else, she insisted, was correct from a naturalistic standpoint. We depend a great deal on Jo and I, as much as anybody in the world. Let me add, the book won an award recently among books on animals. I'd like to add to the list Diane gave me one name, that of Lauren Hunter, and his wife. Where's Leslie? There. And they live in Phippsburg, across the road from us. And Lauren is not only a fine craftsman, but he and Leslie have political and social principles that we admire greatly, and they live up to them also. Now, I could thank many other people, but I will stop here. Let me go back a little earlier. In fact, growing up, I was not a good student. In fact, I was what would be called a C student. Fortunately, I had an aunt who supplemented my schooling by taking me to see touring plays that came through Cincinnati, where I grew up. I still remember from 75 years ago seeing Paul Robeson as a magnificent Othello, surrounded by soldiers with their swords drawn and aiming at his legs, and Othello speaks to them quietly but firmly, "Keep up your bright swords, for the dew will rust them." It's a memorable picture in my mind. After high school, I went to the College of the University of Chicago, where I learned a great deal, but was not ready to settle down. I was in and out of school a lot, hitchhiked around the Southwest, lived for a while in Taos, New Mexico, which I'd read about by D.H. Lawrence. Worked in a veterinary hospital because I like dogs, mostly cleaning cages, I should say. And then worked for a year as a clerk and eventually the manager of a small bookstore, the Red Door Bookshop, near the University of Chicago. One evening at Antioch College, which is a work-study college, you work half the year and you study half the year, approximately, Joe Miles came into the bookshop. And we got to talking about our common interests, which included Dylan Thomas, Wordsworth, and Albert Schweitzer. To make a long story short, I eventually transferred from Chicago to Antioch because I liked the idea of work and study being joined, and I also liked Joe quite a lot. And we were eventually married in Yellow Springs, Ohio. I majored in philosophy at Antioch, and I had my work-study jobs mostly in psychology clinics, where I learned to administer both the Wechsler intelligence test and projective techniques such as Rorschach ink blots and the TAT. I graduated from Antioch, which I liked a great deal, as I did Chicago, in 1953. This was near the end of the Korean War. I was drafted and sent to the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where I was trained to be a medic and to join with infantry units. But an officer noted I had some background in psychology, had me reclassified as an interviewer of soldiers that were being sent to closed psychiatric wards in San Antonio. And I was also able to go to night school and make up some of the time I'd lost as I moved around the Southwest in an aimless way. And my thesis, actually, my master's thesis, compared measures of aptitude by the Wechsler and by the Rorschach ink blots, whether you can believe it or not. Finally discharged from the Army after 2 years, I went in 1956 to the Department of Social Relations at Harvard, a cross-disciplinary department that was set up shortly after the end of World War II to bring together the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, social and clinical psychology, which I liked. I liked them all. It didn't last much more than a dozen years, and psychology's gone in different directions since then, but it was a good time for me. And during my first year as a graduate student, I wandered into Sam Stauffer's course. I'd never heard of Sam Stauffer. His course was called Opinion and Communications. And he showed a deep interest in understanding public opinion. And ever since, I have been involved one way or another myself with polls and surveys. But with continued interest also in anthropology, because I worked some with Cliff Gertz, and in social psychology because of the influence of Gordon Allport, Bill Gamson, and Tom Pettigrew. When finishing my thesis, doctoral thesis, Gordon Allport asked if I would work on developing new measures of racial attitudes, which Larry has mentioned. And these led to my first two published articles, Prejudice and the Norm of Rationality, and Larry gave the names, and Identification with the Underdog, I had been something of an activist in core in the Boston area and drew on this experience, and I think those articles are as innovative and at least as good as any I have ever written. Since then, I've been studying public opinion based on polls and surveys for much of my career, attempting, as I like to put it, to connect method and meaning. Much of what I've learned is in the book, Method and Meaning in Polls and Surveys, and in the several books I've written with people you've heard from today, all of whom are excellent writers and researchers. I would like now to end, or come close to ending, by saying something about my first major attempt to use surveys after the doctoral work was completed. I agreed to join a large cross-national research project that Alex Inglis at Harvard was developing to study the effects of new industrial experience in creating what he called modern men and women as well, but his focus was mostly on men. The idea was to interview samples from rural areas and compare them with similar people who had migrated into urban areas and had factory experience. In Alex's eyes or mind, they were being modernized. And, well, I won't, there are a lot of assumptions made in the comparison that I won't try to detail here. So in 1963, my whole family set out for East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. David, who you heard on the harmonica, was just 6 months old at the time. He was not yet playing the harmonica. Beth was 3 years old, and Mark was 6 years old. East Pakistan had seemed an ideal example of the process that Alex had in mind, because with the partition of India in 1947, villagers who wanted to work in factories in cities could no longer easily go to India because the border was tightly closed. And at the same time, new factories were being built in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and recruiting labor to them. And we were comparing East Pakistan, the cultivators in the agricultural areas of East Pakistan with those who had gone to the cities, making the assumption that they were similar in other ways earlier, which is a risky assumption I would be glad to agree with. I recruited interviewers from the School of Social Work in Dhaka, where they had a number of English speaking. I learned as much Bengali as I could, but that was not a lot. I didn't have the talent that Amy, for example, has with language. But I did go around the country as much as I could. We had a scooter rickshaw and a driver, and we went both into the factory areas and the villages. We'll show you some slides of, this was what was called a traditional factory. You can see it's glass blowing, and from Alex's standpoint, it was traditional and less likely to modernize people than the modern factories. Here we'll show you, that's a biscuit factory called Modern in the book that I'll mention in a And here are some pictures of cultivators in Bangladesh, and an interview with this is going to be a 4 or 5 hour interview, because Alex believed in getting every possible question asked that he could. I never trusted them in that way he did. I was unsure of the results of interviews with people of very little education, although smart enough. And for that reason, I developed something called the random probe, which was a way of asking follow-up questions after people gave their answer to a closed question, to try to have them explain their answer and whether we could make sense of it. They were not without sense usually, but they were often different than we expected, and it proved to be a useful follow-up kind of inquiry. Other data for it, this was a 6-nation study. Mine was Bangladesh. I helped get started the one in India, but had no contacts with the other countries, which were Chile, Argentina, Israel, and Nigeria. We had a lot of illness during that time. Joe had typhoid fever. Mark had severe measles, very different from what you think of in this country. David had a chicken pox that infected his lungs. They don't seem to bother him when he's on the harmonica. And I had amoebic dysentery. Only Beth, our youngest daughter, who we worried most about because she was out in the backyard a lot, not being protected, and she avoided swallowing the quinine pills we hid in her bananas, but she was free of illness throughout our 1.5 years in Bangladesh. As our work was completed, I needed to send it back to the United States, and I was very concerned because there were all kinds of rooms. This was all done out of our house. I mean, our house was the office, and we did everything, training, interviewers, coding, and everything. And I was afraid of the data being confiscated by authorities, either as CIA data or communist data or whatever. There were all kinds of rumors floating about. And I investigated how to make copies of the data because I didn't want to lose. We had more than 1,000 of these long interviews. And photocopying at that time in East Pakistan was not possible. When I looked into the possibility, somebody said you can take a photograph of every page, and there were hundreds and hundreds of pages, and spread them out on the roof to dry in the sun. That didn't seem very practical. So we took advantage of the wage scale in Bangladesh and had every interview copied, literally. And we have a copy somewhere, you'll see, of the old paper, which is falling apart. Anyway, we sent the copies back by airplane, and they did arrive safely, and then we sent the original interviews by ship. It took at least 2 or 3 months, I think, and they came back safely. I held my breath as we went through, as the data were being looked at by the authorities there. I also carried out separately a study of my own, which I trusted somewhat more than the data we had collected in these 6 countries with thousands of respondents. This was in one district of Bangladesh, Camilla, where villages were randomly divided into experimental and control villages. The experimental villages experienced all kinds of training in agriculture, in food preparation, in ways to increase productivity and to improve the health of the villagers. And the other villages, the control villages, randomly separated, could be compared with those. And that became my first book, a monograph entitled Becoming Modern Individual. No, I'm sorry, that's the original English book. Somewhere I have the book and the title on it. It's just a small monograph, actually. Alex, and then I just did not trust the data we had collected in all these 6 countries, thousands of interviews, and therefore I did not take part in the final preparation of the book that is called Becoming Modern, I think is the title. And I asked not to have my name on the book, and Alex accepted that. And so my name does not appear in the book, although he thanks us and he drew on some of the results for his own book. And he wrote a foreword to my monograph. He was a very generous person. Recently, as I was converting my draft into this talk and trying to fit within the time constraints allotted to me, I was about to quote from The Hunting of the Snark and to mention how Stanley and I tried to solve the problem of floaters. I think Stanley will explain to other people who floaters are. And instead of a snark, we found a boojum. Those of you who know The Hunting of the Snark know there's a big difference between a boojum and a snark. And I was going to close finally by reading from my favorite part of Plato's Republic. And Joe reminded me that I was already well beyond the time given to me for this talk. And I remembered that nothing turns out exactly as one planned. And therefore, this is a good ending point. Thank you very much. Sorry I went so long.
That ends the formal part of our program. I want to thank all the participants. I want to congratulate Howard again, and please enjoy dessert and coffee and socializing for the rest of the evening. Thank you, and thank you all for attending.
I wasn't sure, but your insistence.